Um, so my name is Jordan Ermilio, Dr. Ermilio, Dr. Jordan. You can call me Jordan, that's fine. Um, Today we are introducing the summer program on sustainable agriculture, and the topic that I'm talking about is adding value to local commodities in rural areas. And I would like to also touch a little bit on the complexities and issues around sustainable development. Certainly it's a very complex challenge and a complex problem. So I was going to touch on that a little bit as well. Before I get started, I would like to share a little bit about the program at Villanova that I'm the director of. Dr. Satria, who's also here with us today, is also very much involved with this. It is a new program. We just launched this Center for Humanitarian Engineering and International Development. It is an outgrowth from our previous program, which was the Engineering Service Learning Program. And that Engineering Service Learning Program still exists, but now it's a part of a center. And so the three hallmarks of this center are creating curriculum to establish international outreach and to build humanitarian engineering opportunities for students at Villanova and beyond, is to engage with partner organizations internationally in terms of research and really looking at research as a service to nonprofit humanitarian organizations. And of course, continue our service outreach initiatives that we've been working on for many years now. So this is sort of a snapshot overview of our current partners. And of course, IPB, we signed a memorandum of agreement with IPB in 2017, I believe. I know we started the relationship around 2017, and perhaps it was the year later that we formalized the memorandum of understanding and the partnership agreement with IPB, which is very special. So as a personal introduction, it's always important, I think, for everyone to appreciate the context with which people are bringing their particular knowledge and information and experience to a discussion. So my background is somewhat complicated. I think you introduced me perfectly, really well. I did graduate with an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. I did some work with Loughborough University, and that's where I have completed my PhD. I lived and worked in the Philippines doing rural development work for 3 years. I was in an area called Ifugao. It's in northern Luzon, a very mountainous area, very mountainous part of the country. Was working primarily on renewable energy and water supply projects. But it was very much, I was very much engaged in the community development work in this particular part of the country. Beyond that, I worked with Oxfam International in East Timor, formerly a part of Indonesia. And I lived there for a couple of years doing post-conflict emergency relief work right around the turn of the century, where East Timor became an independent country within the archipelago of Indonesia. And then I came back to Villanova, completed my master's, and I did my PhD work, and have founded the Engineering Service Learning Program and now the Center for Humanitarian Engineering. And so my perspective on community development and sustainable agriculture is very much a grassroots perspective because of my prior experience. And in fact, I try to I sort of describe myself as not being an academic in nature. My real passion is community development work, particularly in rural communities. So I really appreciate the topic that's being discussed here today. So to touch on the topic a little bit in more detail, one of the subject areas was adding value. And I think it's a very important thing when you're engaged in community development work and you're engaged in sustainable agriculture development, is to really appreciate the expertise that exists within the local community themselves. And I always describe the scenario where, as foreigners to a particular community, and it doesn't matter what nationality you are, if you're doing community development work and you're doing sustainable agriculture, you're absolutely going to connect to the community development side of the project. Very often, even if you're a national of that country, it's pretty obvious when I'm involved in community development work, especially in other countries, that I'm a foreigner. But when you're engaged in a project, you also have to realize that you are foreign to that community, right? And so respecting and appreciating the knowledge that exists in that community is a really important first step in engaging in that development project. And so by way of an example, I'd like to share this story here, wherein this was a project that I had worked on in the past with a group of students, in fact, from Villanova, where we were working in Ifugao in the Philippines. This is a picture of Fernando Bahatan, and one of our students is also in this picture. And ultimately, the challenge that was being addressed was adding value to local products. And had we came into this particular area, this particular community, with certain expectations or perceptions about the local community, we would never have actually met Fernando Bahatan. He was a local innovator who was solving his own challenges around adding value to local commodities. And really the challenge was farm to market roads and the cost of transporting product to the market. In this particular case, he was growing lemongrass in his farm, and he decided that it wasn't worth it to produce lemongrass, because for about 80 kilograms of lemongrass, you would get about $4 at the local market. However, the challenge was, of course, that the cost to get that product to the market was going to be about $1.50 or even as much as $2. So for 3 months of growing and all of the labor involved in producing 80 kilograms of raw lemongrass, it wasn't worth his time to sell it at the local market, because it was going to cost him $2 to get it there, take 3 months to create that product, and ultimately only gain $2 for that effort. And so what he decided to do was to create a distillery in his local community. And that's what you're looking at in the background of this particular picture. And so as an engineer, I'm sort of also an engineer, my initial solution to this would have been improve the road, right? Because I'm looking at the farm to market road, trying to reduce the cost of getting that product to the market. But he looked at this from a different point of view and said, no, add value to the product itself. And so he started to create byproducts from lemongrass, essential oils, organic fertilizers, and organic pesticides that he was extracting from a hydrosol product that he was creating from raw lemongrass. And so now he was increasing that 80 kilograms at that $4 value to $10, $15, $20 once he added value to the product. And so I think it's really important to respect and appreciate the local community because they live the problem. They understand the problem better than anybody. And ultimately, when you can connect with that local farmer, with the local producer, you can actually improve the process a lot more. So our teams in this particular example, we were evaluating his distillery process and trying to use engineering concepts and heat transfer and thermodynamics to improve the process that he was already engaged in. So this is where we come up with this expression that we have in our program, local solutions for local problems. In other words, our role as external engineers is to identify local innovators that are already solving problems and make their solutions even better. And so that's just a snapshot example of a project that we had worked on. Something that also occurred to me, and I'd like to just share another little story about some of my experience having had worked in the Philippines. This is I had the pleasure of living and working in this particular community here. This is called Banawi, Ifugao. It's somewhat of a well-known World Heritage Site within the Philippines. It's the Banawi Rice Terraces. And something that really struck me living within this community. Lived here for 3 years, loved every minute of it, hiked through these mountains on a regular basis, working on community development projects. Really one of the highlights of my life, to be honest with you. And what occurred to me was this connection, living in this area. What occurred to me was this connection between energy, water, and food. And so I started to really explore this water, energy, food nexus. And it was really shocking when you start to appreciate the amount of energy and the amount of water that goes into producing food. And so something else that I had the opportunity to work on, and again, using this particular concept of working within the local community, helping them to identify solutions to their problems and their issues, and then introducing engineering and introducing technical assistance to help them solve the problems, but really helping them develop the solution, and ultimately using technology, engineering, and sort of a community development approach to helping them solve their own problems, right? As sort of a way to really ensure sustainability. And that's ultimately the key. So what we were looking at in this particular project was this particular water source was actually feeding rice fields for irrigation purposes. And the community wanted to tap into that hydropotential energy that they were using in an irrigation system so that when they were flooding the fields, they could flood and plant during the planting season. They could plant those fields. And when they were harvesting, they could actually bypass the fields with that water resource and produce mechanical energy for the purposes of milling the rice and drying the rice, right? So this is what you're looking at here is a small little hydroelectric facility that this particular community designed, and certainly I helped. I was very much involved in this particular project, but the idea being to tap into the water resources that existed for irrigating these fields, so that when they don't need the water resources for the harvesting period, they could actually use it for milling and drying purposes. And so this is what you're looking at here. And to be honest with you, sort of as a foreigner to this particular community, I would have never personally thought of this solution, right? I would have maybe had other ideas, and this was this solution was much more sustainable because it came from the community themselves. And so that's a really important part of that overall agriculture and sustainable agriculture process, is particularly around rural developing communities, is to really work within those communities to help them develop the solutions so that they own those solutions. And through that ownership, they have the resources and they have the mandate to operate and maintain those particular solutions, those particular technologies. So I wanted to transition a little bit and start talking a little bit about the difference between sustainability and sustainable development, right? And for the most part, when you're talking about sustainable development, and if you're talking about this particular example that we were describing and talking about in the previous slide, if we're really talking about, say, an irrigation system where you're trying to use that resource for mechanical mechanization of agriculture, right? Sort of that agricultural mechanization, but improving or increasing the value of that raw product. So in this particular example from the previous slide, raw palay, as it's called in the Philippines, it's raw rice, unmilled, undried, or sort of semi-dried rice, will get you about 50 cents per kilogram. 20 cents per kilogram. But if that rice is dried and milled and it becomes a further value added in that value chain, small amounts of processing, really about 3 to 6 days of additional processing, it might take 3 to 6 months to grow and harvest that resource, that raw palay, that raw product. But it would take 6 to 10 days to further dry it and then to process it in the form of milling. which will get you 50 cents per kilogram. So it goes from about 20 cents a kilogram to about 50 cents per kilogram, just with that extra 6 to 10 days of processing. So an enormous incentive for local communities to add value to their products. And so this is sort of the project, right? So what you have is the difference between sustainability and sustainable development. Really, in this particular example, the development project is that last step, right? Converting and increasing that value added component to raw rice. Now, sustainability is very often just looking at the environmental constraints of the project. So does this project have zero impact on the environment? Or what are the long-term environmental impacts, right? And that's really what sustainability looks at. It's looking at development through the lens of the environment and the environmental impact. But sustainable development, the project itself, really looks at a more holistic view of sustainability. So what it looks at, and it starts to look at social constraints, right? This is where the social cohesion of the community themselves comes into play. The initial needs assessment, the behavior within a particular community, all of the social elements that go into ensuring that a project will be sustainable in the long term. Furthermore, there's technical constraints to a project, right? So this is really where you're adding in other elements of the development side, right? So now we're talking about sustainable development because you're talking about social, environmental, technical aspects. The technical implementation of that project has to be considered. Long-term operation and maintenance needs, the initial design and construction and the quality of the initial construction all has to be considered within this framework of sustainable development. Furthermore, you have to consider the economic constraints, the financing for a project, the long-term operational costs, the initial capital costs. And one of the things that often gets neglected is the political framework around sustainability, around sustainable development. This is really where that external support comes into play, whether there's governance or certain rules and regulations that are associated with a particular project. So this is a framework which is a lot different than just sustainability, right? Sustainability looking at the environmental constraints and sustainable development looking at all of these holistic elements. And certainly this gets very complex, right? And so I think this is where the theme of the class for this particular program is really, really timely and really important, because the complexity that's associated with this type of framework can be very, very real and very hard to manage. So I think the key to sustainable development is really ensuring the management capacity around that technology. And really, this is where this concept of sustainable management comes into play, wherein you're actually trying to create a structure around the technology, around the initiative that can mitigate what could be external threats to long-term sustainability. And certainly these particular constraints are very complex. It's not so much that these external factors can influence or compromise the sustainability of the project itself. Let's just call it an irrigation system, for example. But these particular constraints also influence each other in a very nonlinear, complex, dynamic way, which creates a very difficult scenario when it comes to ensuring long-term sustainability. So this is the subject of our course for this semester, for this summer program. I'm really excited to engage in these discussions further. And I wanted to end on one particular note, which I think is some additional motivation for our teams here in the coming weeks. So anyone who's involved in this program and in this course, please think about a few things and some of the stuff that we're talking about tonight, and just start to think about ways to add value throughout the process of developing agricultural products. Everything from the production side. I think my example this evening kind of shares a little bit by way of a story of a particular community, but certainly there's very clear steps in the overall agricultural process. And there's certainly mechanization and technology that gets included in some of this. But in terms of production, all the way through harvesting and processing, transportation, and so on to the end product, to the end customer, they're all different steps in that overall process. And the question is, how can you really add value throughout this entire process of developing food, and also considering the water, energy, food nexus, and how these different elements interact with each other. One thing that I'd like to share is sort of my personal opinion about how to add value throughout that supply chain. And this is where, if you can agree that management is the key to ensuring sustainable development, then I would pose that measuring is the key to effective management, in that you cannot manage what you don't measure. And unless you can measure the production process and measure the different steps in the overall agricultural process, you'll have a very difficult time managing, right, each step of that process. And so something that's really engaging and I think exciting for everybody that's involved in these type of projects in the coming weeks, and perhaps even as a career, is this notion that information communication technologies and what is known as the Internet of Things really changes the game when it comes to monitoring and measuring different parts of the overall agriculture process. And so this is where instruments and sensors can really be used to monitor the performance at the very front end of the progress of the production process in terms of producing agriculture products. And certainly every step of the way, low-cost sensors, low-cost computing platforms, ways to communicate with cellular networks, relay information back to farmers and back to different stakeholders throughout the agricultural mechanization process, is really going to be an important step in terms of developing sustainability throughout the agriculture process in years to come. And so I think this is a very interesting time to be involved in these type of projects and this type of work. And I want to welcome everybody to this summer program, and thank everyone for your time and really being interested in this topic. I think this is a really exciting topic, and certainly something that is going to challenge our entire world for many years to come, in fact, perhaps for decades to come, in terms of how do we actually produce food for 9, 10, 11, 12 billion people on the planet. And really it's going to rely on increasing efficiencies throughout this agriculture process. And I really feel that we are at the front end of this, and I'm excited to see where some of the projects go with this class. And again, I want to thank the IPB staff for including me in this effort.